Hey folks, my name's Kevin, and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery, and you definitely mean little today. Look how tiny this thing is, but in case you don't like tiny knives and you're about to click away, they make this exact same knife in a full-size form factor, as well as several other full-size knives that utilize this exact same patented proprietary lock mechanism. Some of them even have two of them. We'll talk about that later. So it's definitely worth sticking around, learning about how this works, who makes this, take this apart, show how it works inside, all that kind of fun stuff. But today we're not just checking out this little guy, we're also going to be comparing it to the brand new production version by Midgards Messer. Now at a glance, these look remarkably identical, and honestly, I'm amazed at how well Midgards pulled this off. But there's some pretty interesting differences between the two, both in terms of how they work inside and also just how you would use them. But let's back up for a moment. What even is this? So this is the Barrel Box Opener from BladesIIB. And its lock mechanism here is called the BBS lock. But who is that? Why is it spelled like that? Why are there so many B's involved? What's any of this mean? Now, BladesIIB is the brand name from custom knife maker Bud Beats. So right off the bat, Bud Beats, two B's, 2B, that's part of it. Bud has been making custom knives for almost 25 years now, but the first 2 decades of that were spent focusing on beautiful yet practical fixed blades. But Bud's connection to knife making goes back even further than that, because his father, Marty Beats, is also a custom knife maker, making knives since the mid-80s. So that's what this Roman numeral 2 here is meant to signify, that Bud is a second generation knife maker. It's worth noting though that while Bud is a nickname, he's not literally Marty Beats II. According to the patent paperwork, Bud's government name is Virgil. Now lastly, he doesn't say this anywhere, but I'm assuming the name BladesIIB is also just meant to evoke the phrase like the one to be, as in the best or the position to strive for, which I assume is Bud's way of describing his aspirations to do the best work he can do. Now about 5 years ago, Bud decided he wanted to try his hand at folding knives. But he didn't want to just make the exact same thing everyone else is making, and that's partly why his knives tend to look different from most of the things out there, but that's also why he set about inventing his own lock mechanism. Now I said this is called the BBS lock. The full name is the Bud Beats Ball Slide. It's because he's Bud Beats, and there is a ball, and it does slide. It kind of more like moves in and out. This piece here slides. Doesn't really matter. So Bud Beats Ball Slide, 3 B's, an S, BBS. What I don't know is if Bud is aware of the fact that it kind of sounds like he's calling his lock BS. I don't know. He has a pretty good sense of humor, but I have no idea if that's intentional at all. I find it personally very funny. Speaking of things that I find funny, the very first time I ever saw his logo, my brain read this as BladesIIB, especially because I was seeing it over here on the kind of version that he has on his cards or on his like patches and stickers and stuff where he capitalizes the L. I can't unsee it. My brain says BladesIIB knives every single time. I find that very funny. I love it. Let's move on. Now I said that this knife is called the Barrel Box Opener, and the latter part is of course a reference to the small, almost Kiradashi-esque blade we have here and its likely primary use case of opening boxes. But that first part is a reference to the barrel cactus, which this knife loosely resembles. Short, squat, boxy. All of Bud's custom folders are named after different varieties of cacti, which pays homage to the southwest landscape of Arizona where he was born. Now, he's got the barrel here. He's got the full-size version called the saguaro. He's got the prickly pear and also the cholla. Now, this production version from Midgards is called the Bragi. That's the Norse god of poetry and music. It's Midgards, so of course they had to do something Norse, but it's nice to see that they stuck with the bee theme. Now, one last thing I want to say here at the beginning is simply that if you plan on attending Blade Show in June, please go visit Bud's table. He's going to be at table 17M. It's kind of in the upper middle portion of the big sea of custom knife makers. Bud is super fun to talk to, and his knives are absolutely worth checking out. Go say hi. And as a bonus, anyone who sticks around to the end of this video, I'll tell his story of how I met Bud the first time and why it's incredibly special to me that I get to check out this production version from Midgards Messer. This is such a cool kind of full circle experience for me. Okay, let's dig into this lock mechanism. Now we'll do that first, that way the people that aren't into tiny things can click away at some point if they want to. This is the Bud Beats Ball Slide, like I said, the BBS lock. And in terms of how you manipulate it, what you do to open and close the knife, this works basically exactly the same as a crossbar lock. What's going on inside is completely different, but how you operate it is something you're already very, very familiar with. Big difference is that, at least on this small version, it's all entirely on one side. There is this little stud, and if you start to manually open it, you'll notice the stud moves back slightly. It's going to be a little bit hard to see here. It's kind of subtle, but you can see it moving back. And then at some point, as the blade fully opens, that's going to spring forward. And now we're locked. And just like on a crossbar lock, the way you unlock this is by pulling this back with your finger, and now the blade is free to fall home. Which means that just like on a crossbar lock, if you want to, one of the ways you can open this is by pulling this back with your finger and then swinging it open. and you can swing it back and forth and like all that kind of fun. Like this is, in terms of manipulation, exactly like a crossbar lock. But because it's implemented inside completely differently, it's got two big advantages over a crossbar lock. And the first is that you'll see that this is a flipper tab knife. Most crossbar locks, I'm going to say like 99% that are on the market, don't have a flipper tab because the bar goes across and it's basically exactly where a flipper tab would need to be in order to travel. And there are a few people out there that have found a way to kind of make a wraparound flipper tab that works, but for the most part, you simply don't find flipper tabs on crossbar lock knives. That's a huge versatility win for the BBS lock. But the much bigger thing in my mind is that crossbar locks are known for having just kind of mushy, soft, wimpy detents. But this, ooh, that is nice and snappy. Over here on the Midgards version, ooh, even snappier. Wow. And the way they're able to pull it off is because the detent here is implemented actually very, very similar to the way it works on something like a liner lock or a frame lock. It's not a leaf spring pushing it over, but it is literally a ball bearing being pushed into a detent hole. And so this is able to have the same kind of snappy, authoritative detent that you would find on a standard liner lock, but in a form factor that works a lot like a crossbar. Now, I mentioned earlier that some of these, the larger knives that he makes, actually has one of these on both sides. And so you'll literally have two studs out and it looks even more like a crossbar lock there. But it's worth noting that these still work independently of each other. You have to pull both back at the same time. On a regular crossbar lock, pulling one back automatically pulls back the other. And that's not the case on the two-sided BBS lock. But in terms of how you do it, you just pull with your forefinger and thumb the same way you would on a crossbar, so it's not any harder to manipulate. Now it's worth noting that on this tiny one, he puts the lock on the back side. He could very easily put this on the front side, and that's much more common. For locks that are only on one side, you typically find it on the show side. And in fact, for sliding bar locks, which the crossbar is a version of, you typically do find it on the side. Like this is Blackie Collins' original bolt action lock, the same kind of like pop forward thing in terms of manipulation, and it's usually on the show side. I think he does it here just to keep it cleaner. This is a very clean aesthetic on the front, and you compare that to the back and we have almost like a bed of nails when it comes to how many screws there are. So I think that's why he's doing it there. But it's worth noting that this is still very ambidextrous in that way. And the clip is not swappable, but it's very, very easy to manipulate this either right or left-handed. Some people might even feel this is more natural as a lefty knife, just because they're used to operating things with their thumb. But it's super easy either way. To explain how this works, let's take this apart, which means we're gonna need our mat. There we go, that's better. Now, what I'm actually gonna do is take apart the version here on the production one, and the only reason is because the screws being overlapped by that clip there, just fewer screws to take apart. They work the exact same way. Now, under normal circumstances, you don't ever need to disassemble this part. For like cleaning and maintenance, you can take apart both of these knives from the front and then do your regular cleaning and reassembly. The only time you would ever need to take this apart is if something got inside the mechanism itself in some way. We're only going to be taking it apart right now so that we can look inside. These are T6 screws, so let's get started. Oh, before I take this last one out, there is something I wanted to say. There's a spring inside here, and so in order to make it not sprawling out on us, let's do this in the open position. I normally don't like taking apart knives in open position because you have the blade exposed, but again, we're not taking apart the knife, we're taking apart the mechanism here. This is going to relax the spring and make it so that it's not under tension. There, now that that's out, we can lift this up and look inside. Right off the bat, you'll see there is this tiny little spring in here. This is actually a really interesting spring. Let's pull that out for a second. This is a rectangular spring. How cool is that? That allows it to sit safely in this channel and not bunch up at all. You'll also see that there is a ball bearing. Quite a large ball bearing, in fact. And on the back side of this, the back side of this stud is attached to this little post. Now this is basically a half circle shaped post, and it is ramped off on one side. This is sitting in that channel, and so the spring is pushing on the back of that and pushing that ramp against that detent ball. So that ramp is now going to be pushing the ball forward and into the handle. Let's pop this ball out for a moment, and now you can see what's going on underneath it. In the closed position, we have a small hole. The ball is able to fall down into that only slightly, which makes it act exactly like a standard detent ball. To open the knife, you have to push that ball back up out of that, which means pushing the ramped bar against this spring. So while it's not a leaf spring, the concept and from a forces perspective of how it works, it's the exact same thing. Now where the magic happens is simply when we open this up, you'll see that a much bigger full-size hole falls into place. And that allows the ball to fully fall inside and the bar on behind it to spring forward, holding it in place. Let's put the ball in so you can actually see that. You can see in this closed position it's sitting up pretty high, but as we open this, it's going to fall fully in. If you're familiar at all with how like a hose quick disconnect works, this is loosely based on that same idea, where you have a ball bearing that's able to fall into a hole or a slot and then have something slide up over place, blocking it from leaving that slot. Now to reassemble this, we're gonna do the exact same thing in reverse. I'm gonna fully open this up so that sits down inside. We're going to take this piece here, make sure our orientation is correct. It needs to be pointing forward. We're gonna pop this down in here. Everything should just lay down pretty easily. We're gonna hold that with our thumb and start putting these screws back in. Okay, we have all of those there. Should just be able to pull that back and it falls closed again. Open it up, no play whatsoever. It's that easy. So what this means is that when the knife is open, that detent ball becomes the lock ball and pushes into the blade and is held in place there by this spring bar at the back. So to close this, to basically break this lock, you would need to completely shear that ball, break the blade, or break the handle. So we're talking complete catastrophic failure. And what that means is that this lock mechanism is actually quite strong. And on the versions that have two, the larger versions, you're literally doubling the strength because you're now dividing that closing pressure against both of those balls. And so the end result is this is actually a very strong lock. Bud hasn't done any really clinical testing on the strength, but he has a video up on his channel where he did a kind of risky way of testing it, and he was able to get up to around 300 inch-pounds of pressure, and it still held perfectly fine, which puts it comparable to things like frame locks. So what we're left with is a lock mechanism that has the same kind of relatively ambidexterity of a crossbar lock, a lot of the same strength as a crossbar lock, but with a way better detent. Oh, that's so much better. And the ability to have flipper tabs. All around, this is kind of just better. Now, there is the one exception, of course, that this is kind of messy looking, but Bud's original patent actually shows how you can do this exact same thing here from the inside. You just basically have the channel cut on the inside of the handle and put the plate on the inside, and it works the same way. And in fact, he has a new production collaboration coming out from Artisan based on the longer version of this knife is going to be doing that approach. He actually hasn't done it himself in any of his customs yet, so it'd be cool to see that actually come to market. Now, for being super technical here, and we should be, the ball is not actually falling all the way into that hole. If you think about it, you can't let it fall past this center spot, or else you wouldn't be able to push the ball back up out once you've removed the bar that's blockading it. It would be kind of like one of those trick knives from back in the day where you'd have to kind of lean it to the side and tap it in order to get the ball to come out. Now it's going in far enough that the shear force is going to be towards the center at this thicker spot, but it's also going in just far enough that the bar is able to slide in behind it and block it from backing out. But there actually is a difference in how these two knives are pulling it off. You'll notice that here on the custom version, this bar is fully at the front of this. It can't go any further forward. On the production version, there's still a little bit of room there. It's not all the way in. That has to do with the shape of the bar itself, and there actually is a pretty significant difference to what this means, even though it might look subtle at first. To explain that, I'm going to have to take this one apart after all, so let's do a little bit of editing magic. Now, if you remember, on the production version, there's a ramp running this entire way. On the custom version from Bud, there's only this domed surface at the front, and the rest of this is completely flat. While we have this open, you can see that the inside of this basically looks exactly the same, including those neat little rectangular springs. What that means is that on this production version, this ramped bit here at the back of the bar is always wedging. You're still on that ramp, and so it's wedging further in and always applying some amount of inward pressure and keeping everything tight. What that means is that there's no vertical play on this whatsoever. Everything's being held in place in that kind of wedged position. And as it wears in, it's going to wedge slightly more and slightly more and slightly more. Over here, the bar is fully behind it. It's no longer applying pressure this way because it's not actually wedging against it. It's just slid behind it now. So technically speaking, this is the safer of the two. There's absolutely no way that attempting to push this ball out has any capability of sliding this bar backward. It's not pushing on that bar in any kind of way where any component of its force is going to push backward. Here, because you are technically working against a ramp, a very small portion of your force is pushing backwards against the bar. It's such an incredibly tiny portion of your force, given the flatness of the ramp at that spot, how far that ramp is and where that ramp is actually making contact against the ball, but technically a very small portion of your force is pushing in that backward direction. So this implementation is technically safer, but it does come at the cost of the fact that you no longer have that kind of wedged, everything held in place with a ramped lock face kind of lineup. So what you can get is a tiny bit of vertical play. You can see this actually does have a little bit of vertical play here, but don't be alarmed by that. Vertical play doesn't mean the same thing in different locks. You care about vertical play on something like a liner lock or a frame lock because it indicates that the lock bar itself is not making secure contact with the lock face. Here, vertical play simply means that there is a very small gap between some of these components, but it doesn't mean that any of those components can slip. This bar is completely blocking that fully, and so it doesn't matter how much wiggle there might be between those parts. It'll never ever be able to slip back just because it's wiggling. Now, I can understand their decision to make the change the way they did, because I think this trade-off is probably worth it. Being wedged in here as deep as it is so similar to this kind of engagement that it basically, for all intents and purposes, can't move backward, and you get that total lack of blade play since everything is still under compression. Technically speaking, this is more secure. Okay, let's finally dig into this as a knife and compare it to the production version over here. Let's start off with the things that are basically identical between them, and that's the general size, specs, all that kind of stuff. We're talking a very tiny little knife here. This is just over a 1¼ inch blade. I measured it at 1.28 inches, measuring from here to that tip. Of course, you got much longer if you go along this arc of the cutting edge. When you have it in the closed position, since there is this tiny little flipper tab that sticks out, we're looking at about 2.4 inches closed. Very, very tiny, very easy to fit into your pocket. And you combine those two things together, you get an overall length of 3.626 inches. Now, the specs here between them are basically identical. I'm blown away by how incredibly well Midgards was able to recreate the size, shape, and appearance of this knife. From what I heard, they didn't actually use the original CAD. They kind of reverse engineered everything. And so it's incredibly cool to see how dead on these specs are. They have nearly identical thicknesses of blade stock. We're talking 0.145-ish, something like that. And the overall thickness of the handles is, again, basically identical at 0.54 inches. Now, where there is a difference is in the max width if you include the outermost part of the clip. Over here, he's using a clip that he bought from MXG Gear. You might recognize that clip. And it does just stick out a little bit further. And so the overall thickness, if you include that, is 0.81 inches over here. They have a custom clip. We'll talk about the difference between them later, but for the thickness perspective, it's just a little bit thinner, coming in at 0.73. Now, something I'm a little bit surprised by, and I don't fully understand where it's coming from, is that there is a weight difference, and this one is slightly lighter. This is 3.1 ounces, and this is 3.25. They're so incredibly similar in size and specs everywhere that I'm not really sure where that's coming from, but that's still a very, very small difference. What that means is that both of these are lightweight knives. 3.1 ounces is not a heavy knife, but for how tiny this is, it definitely feels heavy for its size in a way that gives it this kind of like nugget feel. It actually feels delightfully kind of chunky in your hand with this kind of worry stone quality with how incredibly smooth and rounded off these fillet edges are. It definitely is fun to just kind of like hold in your hand. And that carries over for the production version too. They have the exact same kind of melty quality that is very, very satisfying. Now, the blades on both of these are mirror polished. Look at how incredibly shiny they are. Like, oof. Super duper shiny. I was really impressed with the fact that they were able to make that so similar looking. You will notice right off the bat that this is a hollow grind. You see how it's warping the light here? Over on the production version, we do have a flat grind. And we're working with CPM 154 on the custom and 14C28N on the production. So I like the steel choices on both of these. And boy, are they just beautiful looking. They have very, very similar, not quite crowned, but somewhere between crowned and swedged tops. Like there's definitely these pronounced swedges, but it's smoothed out in this way that is so soft. It's very, very pleasant to push your finger against. And check out this filing. I was really not expecting them to be able to pull off this filing so authentically. This is completely hand filed by Bud. And you can see that there is a subtle difference in depth. Let's see if I can show that easily. If I pull it out at this halfway point, you can see how deep it goes in. If I do the same thing over here, you can see that it is ever so slightly shallower in terms of just how deep those cuts are. But my goodness, tremendously similar. That's something that I think has to be done by hand. I mean, maybe you can do this with a machine, but I feel like that's got to be done by hand. And it's just so incredibly cool to find beautiful hand filing like that on a production knife. The jimping that we see at the back here is, again, very, very similar. There are subtle differences between them, but they're basically interchangeable. Both of them give you pretty good traction. And in general, this is the kind of flipper tab where you're pulling against this back corner right here. Now, I will say that means on both of them, there is this kind of corner, and it does kind of dig into your finger. It's not the most comfortable flipper tab in the world, but it's not hard at all. And especially what you do is pull right up along the front of this. Instead of pushing in on this corner, you pull back from this front part. You just flip back and it works super duper well. You can see we've got this gorgeous mirror finish everywhere. And that is something that they carried on over here. You've got the mirror all the way around the back and everything. It's really cool to see. Now on the custom, he mirror polished this backspacer as well. On the production version, they gave this the same kind of lightning anno finish. Let's talk about that for a moment. This is called an entropic finish. It's sometimes called a lightning anno finish. It's a really cool process that's done through heat and chemicals. And it's just a weird, neat thing that titanium happens to be able to do. Now what's really interesting to me is that this is pretty monochrome. You'll see that this is almost exclusively blues and whites. There's a little bit of a purple color right about there. It's going to be hard for my camera to even focus on this because of how shiny it is. And the thing is on the versions that I've seen in all of the pictures everywhere, I've not seen that many, but all of them have been this relatively monochrome blue and white. And that's actually kind of hard to do. In fact, I don't really know how they did it because entropic finishes like this often have very bright reds and yellows and kind of orangey colors as well. I don't know if they're all going to be like that, but if they are, that's really cool. It gives it a much kind of more refined look. Lightning anno can be a little bit too psychedelic for me, but having a relatively monochrome version like that definitely gives this a little bit more of a classy, refined quality to it. While we have the blades open, let's talk about one of the pretty subtle differences here, and that's just how this logo is being done. On the production version is being done with a laser. This is what you'll typically find on most modern knives. It is dark. It's not really feelable. This here is electrochemically etched. And so this is deep. You can actually run your finger over that. You can see it. And if you zoom in, you can definitely look at the kind of texture going on in there. This is not significant, but this is the kind of stuff where you're never really going to find this on a large scale batch production. And you probably won't find this on a small custom production just because, well, I mean, unless you own a laser or have access to a laser engraver nearby. Now let's talk about one of the most significant differences between these. Not only does the production version have a custom clip, which honestly I think is pretty cool, and I think it's honestly an improvement, but they changed the direction that the clip is facing. That's a pretty big deal. On the custom version, this MXG gear clip is mounted at the back, and you have what you would consider modern standard tip up carry. So you pull this out of your pocket, reach down, and flip this open. On the production version, they swapped the orientation of that. So it is now tip down carry. So you have to pull this out, rotate this around, and then open. Now, I personally probably wouldn't have done that myself, but there is a reason that Midgards gave for making that change. And that's because they wanted the ability to clip this directly onto a belt. Now, if you're going through a pocket or something that's really easily flexible, you'll notice that this stud might look like it's getting in the way here. But pockets are really flexible and can easily manipulate around that. I've never had any trouble getting this in and out of my pocket, but you might if you have really, really stiff material like a belt. So they found that when they were trying to push this over a belt, the act of sliding this in would press against this stud and accidentally open up the knife. But they really wanted to support this for some reason. Not entirely sure why it was important to them, but by flipping it upside down, now when you push in here, if the belt hits this, you're pushing it in the direction of locking it further. So there is kind of a safety benefit to having it upside down like this. Like I said, I've never had any issues with it hitting and snagging on this in my actual pockets. And since I'm right-handed, since if I'm sliding this into the side, if there is any amount in which this gets slightly opened up and is able to come down out like this, it's just going to get pushed back inside by the back corner of my pocket. From an ergonomics perspective, I think that the shallower clip here is more comfortable in terms of not just not sticking out as far. I have a pet peeve around tall clips that are on the edges of knives because you definitely can feel it digging into your hand. Your hand doesn't have anywhere to wrap back around and be supported by the frame again. And so I definitely can feel this little clip here, but it's not bad. And this is not the kind of knife you're going to be really squeezing super hard anyway. So I do find that this shallower clip is a little bit nicer, but then you have the problem of it being at the front and it still is up against the edge. And I've never really liked front mounted clips, tip down carry clips, because the part where I'm going to be squeezing the most if I were to really be pushing hard on a knife like this would be at the front. But like I said, you're never really going to be doing what I'm doing right now. This is a knife that's meant for this kind of grip or this kind of grip. So let's talk about this blade shape and how it works for cutting. Now he calls this the barrel box opener because he thinks that this is primarily going to be used for opening boxes. And as a fifth pocket knife, I think that's probably likely the case. I called it a almost kiridashi at the beginning of this. A kiridashi blade shape would be just like a straight edge right here. And instead we have some belly this entire way. And honestly, I prefer this to a traditional kiridashi because with a knife with belly, you can make contact at all these different points and it's easier to use the entire length of the blade rather than just the tip. But like a kiridashi, the tip is right at the top. And you would find on a traditional box opener, something like a utility blade, that's the exact opposite. I prefer this most of the time if I'm doing box opening type tasks because I want to be able to hold it like this in my hand and be able to get that tip down without having to crane my wrist at all. Now this is such a small knife that it's not hard at all to get to this tip. You don't actually have to twist your wrist all that much. But the thing is, this is such a small knife that you don't need to hold it in this grip that you normally would for using utility cuts. Instead, you can hold it in this grip. This kind of pencil grip is what kiridashi blades are actually meant to be held in. This is especially nice if you want fine detail work because you're already used to this kind of motor control from using a pen and a pencil. And so you can get really detailed little cuts like that in this pencil grip. Now on both of these, we have a really nice acute little tip. So you definitely can get into tiny little crevices and do fine little detail puncturing if you need to like open one of those like clamshell packages and not puncture what's inside the clamshell. If you want to dig in like that, it works really, really well for that. We've got thick enough blade stock that this wouldn't be what I would call a slicing knife ordinarily, but this is not a slicing blade. You've got a tiny little triangle here. You're not really meant to be tearing through cardboard. You technically could, but you would want to be putting a lot of forward angle pressure and kind of pushing through the cardboard like that to make sure you still stay in the blade. It'd be really easy to slide out on a knife this small. It's just not meant for that. Now, like I said, you do go from a hollow grind to a flat grind here, and that will make a custom version a little bit slicier since it simply stays thinner for longer, but there's not all that big of a difference here in terms of cutting performance. And the big reason is, like I said, you're not really going to be cutting through materials. You're primarily going to be using a knife like this to be cutting with the tip or just kind of like a slice along something that is much thinner. But that thicker blade stock makes this very, very comfortable if you do need to push some force here or like that. And this file work, it works like jimping, and it is, it locks you in pretty good. But I do think it's mostly decorative on this knife because you're just primarily not going to be using it in this kind of grip. Let's talk about a difference that might seem subtle at first, but actually has an interesting implication here. You'll notice that they both have this plate and it visually looks very similar, but on the production version, they've scooted this thing backwards slightly and they've just made it all around a little bit smaller. What that means is that this plate doesn't overlap with this screw at all. They did that, I'm sure, because it's just easier for them. But it has an interesting side effect. And honestly, I don't know if it's a side effect that Bud intended. On his full-size versions, things are located slightly differently too. And so what I'm about to talk about isn't present on those knives. But on this little one, you can see that this front screw right here actually overlaps with where this pivot screw would want to turn. It's actually blockading that pivot screw. So again, He doesn't do this on the bigger ones, and so I'm not 100% sure this is actually intentional or just kind of a fun side effect. But right now, this front screw is actually keeping this a captive pivot. What that means is if you're trying to disassemble from this side, you would need to take this screw out first before you could actually turn this. But you don't need to disassemble from this side. To take this knife apart, you only need to take out these 3 screws. And because that is there, this acts as a captive pivot, and you can take this out quite easily. Over on this side, again, you would disassemble it by taking out these 3 screws, but this is no longer captive on the back. And so you do kind of have a free spinning pivot. You'll also notice the clip is basically blocking your ability to put your screwdriver in there. Now, I've taken this apart several times, and I've found that just putting my finger on the back here is enough pressure to hold it in place. I've never actually had the need to take this clip off and put a second bit in there. But if for some reason yours is like really, like let's say you put a lot of Loctite in or something like that, you will need to take apart this clip and put a second bit in here. And those bits are big. I think they're T15s. Let me look real quick. Yeah, T15s. So disassembling this might be tricky if you happen to Loctite it really hard, because you would need 2 different T15s and you might just not have that in your set. But like I said, I didn't need it. I was able to just use my finger pressure like that, and it didn't come with any significant amount of Loctite on it. We're going to take these apart and look at some subtle differences inside, but we'll also see the #1 biggest difference between these ones we've taken apart. And that's simply that this one here is on bearings and this is on washers, but this one is washers with a bushing pivot. What that means is that these are both incredibly free-flowing knives. When I take this pressure off, this is able to really easily swing. Even though this is on washers, it is super, super free-flowing because, like I said, we have a bushing pivot, which is keeping the blade tension very, very careful here. Over here, this is on bearings now, which means this is exceptionally free-flowing, even more so than over here, just because, well, even if you have a bushing pivot, you still have sliding friction versus rolling friction. Okay, these are really easy to take apart. And like I said, for regular maintenance, you don't ever have to worry about this lock part itself. We're just gonna come from the front. And on both of these, we've got a T15 and some T6s at the back. So let's try this one first. And then come in with our T6s. Now at this point, this should just come right off. I think it usually helps to open this up and take the pressure off a little bit. Kind of fighting me here because it's pretty tight clearances on these parts. You'll see why in just a moment. I'll use a little prying tool to make it easier for me to pull up without cocking it to the side. There we are. Now let's do the same over here. If you're a crazy person like me and decide to take both of these apart at the same time, make sure that you don't mix up your hardware. They look tremendously similar. Like look how similar these are. They nailed the aesthetic, but as far as I know, these aren't interchangeable. I mean, they might be. I'm not about to try. That came out a little bit easier. Now, you can see that what's going on in here is basically the same. In both cases, we've got a stop pin. Put that over there. But like you can see, there is phosphor bronze washer on the left and aged ceramic ball bearings on the right. Now, like I said, this one has a pivot bushing. What it means is that there is a barrel that goes around the pivot that is sitting up taller than the actual blade itself, and it sits flush against this other side. The distance there is all carefully spaced so that this washer is able to flow smoothly and not get pinched. Now, one subtle difference between these two is that on the custom version, these screws in the back are threading into these barrel spacers here, versus over here on the production version, they're threading directly into the titanium backspacer. Now, this isn't a big deal, but technically speaking, from a longevity perspective, this is a little bit better because if you were to strip one of these threads, you only have to replace a barrel spacer and not the entire backspacer. I will say though that means that these are kind of free flowing here, and so you might find that you need a second bit on the back to hold this in place. By threading directly into the backspacer, you can tighten down either side without having the other side spin because it's the backspacer itself that you're threading into. Now, they do have an additional kind of stabilizer locator pin at the back on the production version. That helps during the initial assembly when you don't have these screws on the back holding it in. Once you have those screws in, as long as you don't take them out, then there's no real need to ever take that pin out, and this will all stay in place. Now, there is one other really weird, fun little difference that you'll notice here, and that's that there is a bearing ball right there. Bud has embedded a ball bearing in this handle side. It rides on this path right here. You can see that smile-shaped arc. But this isn't a detent ball or anything like that. There's no hole on either side of it. It's just providing additional support further away from the pivot. I've never really seen anyone do this before, but it's kind of a fun way, like I said, adding a larger lever distance support and provide more lateral stability. Reassembling these is really easy. It's just a matter of undoing what we did before. Now, like I said before at the start, this one has slightly tighter clearances, so it might have to kind of pop into place. Let's see. You can hear that snap sound. Okay, everything seems lined up, so it's just a matter of putting these screws back in. Now I mentioned that these are free spinning on the back and you might need another tool. I've never actually found that I needed it. I can just hold it in place with my finger and that provides me enough tension. Now for tuning this, there's not a whole lot you need to do. This is a bushing pivot, which means you're supposed to crank this all the way down. And with it cranked all the way down like that, this is still very, very free flowing. That's the whole point of a bushing pivot for a washer knife. So there's real no tuning need to be done. We're done. Now over on this side, everything should be pretty darn similar. We just need to align that pin there and this pin there. That was super duper easy. Let's get these screws in. Now this one you do have to tune it. Let's see where I ended up with right now. Pretty good. Tiniest bit of play. Like I said, I haven't personally needed a second bit. I can just put my finger there and see if I can tighten this just a smidge more. Play is gone. And we're back. Okay, so what are my final thoughts on this? Honestly, I absolutely love this knife. I love small fifth pocket knives. I love small box cuttery knives. And I love creative, inventive lock mechanisms, especially when they are actually really practical and not just novel. This has all of the benefits and kind of ease of use of a crossbar lock, but you get the snappy detent that you're missing on a crossbar lock. It's just so fun, and you still can absolutely do all of the kind of fun, flippy manipulation you can on a crossbar. So from a lock perspective, I love this. And from a knife perspective, I love this. I love box cuttery things. I will say that I think I would still like a Wharncliffe version or a sheepsfoot version even more, or just like a modified sheepsfoot. You know, the tip comes down to about there. Now on the full size version of this knife, he does offer a sheepsfooty version. So hopefully someday he transports that into the mini version like this. I'd love to see that variant. All you'd really have to do is change the shape of this backspace right here in order to facilitate that blade fitting in there. But even as is, it's still so easy to use and works so well for that kind of box opener use case. And this production version is so good. I can't believe how well they've pulled off so many of the characteristics of the custom that you normally would only ever find on custom knives. This mirror polish blade like this and that filing work on the back, man, this is incredible. You just don't find production knives with those things. It's so snappy, it's even snappier. And I actually really like it on bearings. It has wonderful sounds. It's exceptionally fun to play with. It's exceptionally fun to just kind of hold in your hand. I genuinely really love these knives. Okay, I said I was going to tell the story about how I met Bud and why it is so incredibly cool to me to get to check this out. And that's because I didn't learn about this mechanism from Bud. I learned about Bud from this mechanism. I have spent countless hours over the last several years digging through the patent databases, and I actually discovered this patent first before learning about the knives that it was employed on. At the time, it was only on the larger knives that he had, and so that was really, really cool to me. But when he finally came out with this tiny little knife, oh my God, this is the most me knife. I love tiny little knives, I love little box carrying knives, and I love proprietary lock mechanisms. And so this is tailor-made for me. And so when I learned that he was going to be at Blade Show last year, and I learned he was going to bring these, this is literally what I went to Blade Show to buy. I mean, I went to Blade Show to meet with everyone and talk and spend time, all the kind of wonderful things you have at Blade Show, but literally this is the only knife that I intended to buy last year, and it's the only one that I did buy. So I found his booth, and I walk right up to it. Now, this is a new lock, and so out of a sense of precaution and safety, they had a demo model at the front that was unsharpened. And I get that. This is so incredibly similar to a crossbar lock in terms of how you manipulate it that I don't think they strictly needed that. This is super intuitive to people, but I get the sense of safety. So I walk up to the table, and Bud's wife, I don't know her name, I'm sorry, she started directing me to interact with that one first. And I said, oh, sure, absolutely. I'm happy to follow your lead, however you want to do this. But I will say that I'm already completely familiar with your lock. In fact, I've actually read through the entire patent and everything like that. And I'm really, really excited to finally get to play with it. And she's like, what, really? And she's like, hey, Bud, you got to talk to this guy. He's actually read through your patent. Buzz like, what? And so I explained to Bud that indeed, this is one of the most me knives that have come out in a really long time, and I'm so excited to finally get to play with it that I've read through the entire patent. I love how this works. I want to talk with him all about it, and I was really excited to buy this knife from him. And he had this kind of just big grin on his face for a moment, and he just goes, I knew I made this for someone. And yeah, he made it for me. He didn't know he was making this knife for me. He hadn't met me yet, but this is the most me knife. It's tailor-made for me. So we talked for probably about 20 minutes, and he is so fun and easy to talk to. Really, really cool guy. Like I said, go to Blade Show. He's going to be at booth 17M. Really, really cool guy. But how does this come into play? So I bought this knife from him and everything like that. And we had a great interaction. So he remembered me, luckily, the next day. And so when he saw me, he goes, hey, Kevin, guess what? And I go, what? And I come over. He goes, you won't believe it. Midgards Messer came by and bought 2 of these barrel box openers and said they want to do a production run. Now, this is so funny to me because Midgards Messer is known for making absolutely enormous knives. They make incredibly cool knives and they love gadgety mechanism stuff. So it's actually in some ways a totally perfect fit, but it's also a hilarious fit because they were just that last year at Blade Shows where they were debuting the giant Locken Valhalla. Here, I'll just get that out and show you. This knife, the giant Locken Valhalla. And so the fact that this company, that I can't even fit this on my screen at the same time, the fact that the company that made this, it really won't fit. The fact that the company that made this knife wanted to make a production version of this knife, this tiny little thing, is absolutely hilarious. But how cool is that? And he was so excited about this. This was his first ever production collaboration. And I got to hear about the starting of this, that moment where he was first learning that this is going to come into existence. And we just nerded out for a little bit about how incredibly cool that is, how funny this collaboration is, but how, again, this makes perfect sense. You saw how this folds, right? This is, they're into this kind of gadgety stuff. So I told him back then at Blade Show how happy I was for him and how incredibly, excited I was for that to come to fruition. And so 8 or so months later, when this finally dropped, I can't believe this is now here. And I'm just so happy with how well this turned out. This is so incredibly faithful to the original. They absolutely nailed this. There are differences. There are things that set them apart. So even if you aren't someone that cares about the fact that this is made by a single guy in the US, I think he's in Texas these days, there are still reasons why you might choose one over the other. But this is really cool because this does come in at a significantly lower price point, almost half what this does. And so this does make it even more accessible to other people. But this is just the start of great things to come for Bud. Like I said earlier, he's got another production coming for the longer version of this, the Squero Gentleman's Folder, which I think is gonna be through Artisan, he said. Can't wait to see that one. And honestly, like I said, this is a fantastic knife with a fantastic mechanism. I can't wait to see what's coming. Now, if you do want to buy one of these, you can get this directly from Midgards' website. You might be able to get this on some of the dealers that carry Midgards. I'm not sure. It was a limited run. There's only 600 of these that were made. I personally recommend you going directly through Bud. Bud was so happy with how this turned out that he bought a handful of them himself to sell through his own store. And if you do buy this directly from Bud, for one, you'll get this extra little COA card that he's throwing in them that he made. But for 2, this is the way that you get the most portion of your money going directly to Bud. And since I think that is, generally speaking, the goal when trying to support a small maker like that, I definitely recommend, if he still has any of these in stock, buying it directly from him. But that's also where you'll be able to find these, or any of the full-size versions that he makes in his other models. You'll find that all at BladesIIB, spelled BladesIIB.com. And you can also find him on Instagram and Facebook, and what's really cool is you can find him on YouTube. He has a bunch of really cool behind the scenes videos. He's one of those makers that just likes to explain how he does stuff for the betterment of others. And so you can follow along the entire process of making this, but also just all the other weird stuff that he gets up to. It's not just knife stuff. He is just one of those makery people that likes to fix stuff and make stuff with his own hands and with tools. And it's really fun to watch. So go subscribe to his channel as well. So huge thank you to Bud for sending this my way to make this video. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next time.